tell me where the Ambassador Hotel is? I thought it was on this block, and I don't recognize it.
My guest today is Evan Tonzig. He's a well-known figure on the OSU campus, associate professor of music, and he gave me a list of things he teaches, starting out with cello and music theory, and going on and on. He estimates he's taught 20 courses on the campus. So he's a wide-ranging and broadly knowledgeable man. I decided just to sit down with him and pick his brains because Evan, if you don't already know, is a very interesting person to talk to. And I wanted to start out with a question that I've been interested in, and that is classical music dead? Is it past its prime? Is it anachronistic? Are the people who perform it and who make a living from it, are they anachronisms today? Evan?
I love questions like that. I love them. Mainly because there's no answer. There's no simple answer to it. And also, it sparks all of these reactions. Now, you warned me about that question, Jim. And so ever since you warned me, it's been watching this fireworks show go off in my brain. Here's some of the sparks from that question ignites. First of all, one of the things I thought when I was washing dishes or trying to begin washing dishes was, well, there are people that say the planet is dead. And I was thinking, what would you say if somebody came up to you and said, well, after all, classical music is dead? I would have to say, it's like beauty. It depends on the eye of the beholder. It may be dead for that person. It certainly is not dead for me. And I do have to think why a person might think classical music is dead. And that's what causes a lot of the sparks, because that rang the bell that we are in an absolutely unique position in the history of our planet, in that a number of changes have taken place within the last 100 years that have made us be in a situation that nobody's ever been before, so it's hard to judge by past standards. For instance, in music. In 1877, Edison invented the phonograph. In 1888, 100 years ago, he actually devised a better means of operating the dang thing. And since then, the world has been changed. Because right now in this house, we can listen to music from any place on the planet. We can listen to music from almost all of the periods of classical music, from around 900 AD to this very year. In classical music, we can listen to all kinds of popular music, from early recordings of ragtime. We can listen to Joseph Lamb or Scott Joplin recordings of them playing. We can hear early Dixieland recordings that unfortunately didn't come from New Orleans, but they came from Chicago, but with New Orleans players. We can listen to all the various kinds of evolutions of jazz, including some of my favorites, Art Tatum and that sort of thing. We can listen to pre-rock and roll. We can listen to boogie woogie. We can listen to juke joint blues that were like rock and roll. We can listen to early Elvis. We can listen to all of the evolution of rock and roll we can listen to folk music. We can listen to all this stuff. And I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of the world when somebody sitting in one room can hear music of all the greatest orchestras and all of the greatest musicians from all sorts of periods, people that have been dead. We can listen to someone that was born in 1835 if you like. I mean, I've got a recording of Camille Saint-Saëns in stereo, and he was born around 1835. And, you know, it's sort of hard to say. In old days, it would be easy just to see what music was being published and what music was being played as to what music was dead and what music was alive. But now, Jim, we're in a unique position where all of this music is continually available to anybody that wants to invest the energy into getting that stuff. It's all available now, so it's harder to say what's alive and what's dead. Maybe the difficulty of that question with me is, the reason it causes so many sparks is I'm not really sure what you mean, because
Yes.
if we were born 150 years ago, I think I could answer it
Mm-hmm.
with more confidence. But now I'm sort of,
Yeah, all definitions tend to be out the window right now, and we don't know what classical music is.
well, we know what classical music is, and there is a contemporary classical music.
Mhm.
You also said earlier, Jim, something about what the Kronos Quartet said to you, only I forgot. What?
Oh, they basically bemoan the fact that most composers that are played by major orchestras are dead. Most music, you could almost say there is a top 200 music chart of classical music that appear on almost every major orchestra's schedule almost every year, various pieces of it. Is this being worked to death? And I think that's the implication the Kronos Quartet was saying. Hey, look, on the one hand, we're working all this old music to death, and on the other hand, we're allowing composers today, contemporary composers, to starve or to we're not playing their music. Would you agree with that?
Jim, I think that most of the things that you've retained that they told you are absolutely true as far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true, if you don't mind my saying so, of radio stations, even ones that I love intensely and cherish, and even with program directors that I admire and will support in every way possible because they do such a fine job. I do have to say, from my own particular viewpoint, that well, it's not the radio station. There's a certain amount of the populace that wants to hear, for instance, 2 times this week, versions of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. On the radio this week, we have had 2 versions of the Tchaikovsky.
Were they live from one of the orchestras?
These were live. One was New York Philharmonic, and I think the other one was St. Louis. I'm not sure.
I know Paula Price tries desperately not to repeat music during a week.
Right, but there are certain war horses. Orchestras play, and that radio programs, and that is a problem. But I think the same thing is true in rock and roll. I was visiting Nashville this summer to a young group that's been turning out some new things. And one of their laments was they were going around radio stations trying to peddle. They're a very popular group. They were trying to peddle some of their recordings to local DJs.
Yes.
But no, the local DJs in rock and roll wanted to play the Don Henley middle-of-the-road hits, all she wants to do is dance, gets played, but some new song doesn't.
That brings up another question, though. KOSU runs, I don't know how many hours a day of classical programming, every day of the year. Is there a point at which you get so saturated with classical music that either you want to turn it off or else it simply becomes muzak, background music? And is it fair to treat it as background music?
It's hard for me to answer that. I have to admit something. When I was, I think, 30 years old, I had a wonderful, wonderful friend, a young lady, who pointed out that I didn't know how to take care of myself because I didn't know how to cook. And so she taught me how to cook. And she also pointed out that I was absolutely helpless without a car. I couldn't get around. And she could go anywhere without a car. And I said, how? And she said, hitchhiking. So she decided to teach me at least the method of hitchhiking. So if I ever needed to, if I ever had car troubles, I could get back. And so we took a trial trip hitchhiking with all the proper methods. And there was one thing I learned, Jim, that every car lived in a different universe. I had this idea that we all live on the same planet. We don't. One of the most mind-shattering experiences was every car we got into, those people didn't live on my planet Earth. They lived on some other planet Earth that I didn't even know about. And so, for as far as the way people listen to music, all I can tell you is myself. If you were out here, if you planted a microphone out here and monitored it 24 hours a day, you would hear a lot of music, but not as much as you might suspect. one of the reasons I live out here where the loudest sound is insects and birds is because I love silence.
Mm-hmm.
And when I play a piece of music, I usually don't do something else. It would be like having a white wall in a beautiful studio with wonderful lights and taking a painting from your collection and putting it up on that wall and having a chair, or maybe several chairs at varying distances, and sitting down at the chair and just drinking in that painting.
Well, do you think you're an
That's the way I like
exception?
to listen.
Aren't you an exception in that? Okay.
There are some times, however, when background music is absolutely appropriate. For instance, I like Fats Waller to sweep the rug by.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Because Fats says, life isn't so bad, and get into the rhythm of
That's
this,
right.
and pretty soon the job will be over.
I like Gregorian chants to study by. And of course, when you get into the modern period, you have people like Eric Satie who actually purposely set out to invent Muzak, if you will.
I wonder if Steve writes music for 18 musicians. Have you heard it?
No.
Oh, can I play a little bit of that?
We'd better get on with the interview.
But that is wonderful wallpaper music. It's a kaleidoscope where not much is happening melodically.
Mm-hmm.
Not that much is happening harmonically, but these colors are a kaleidoscope of folding sounds. There's a repetitive pattern and a steady beat beneath it, and all these things just sort of fold and blend. And if you've not heard Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, you must hear that sometime. Please promise me you'll hear it.
I'll try. Now I'm going to try to lasso you back a little closer to the original question.
What was that?
And it was a long time ago, is what it was. But the orchestra, as we know it today, of course, is an evolving thing. And I was wondering if you think, both as a person who's played in orchestras, as a teacher of orchestral music, that it's become anachronistic. It's grown in size in the last century and a half, 2 centuries. It's nothing like it was in the 18th century in many ways. Is it becoming an elitist institution that's too large for urban centers that are grappling with other problems to support?
Well, I had been thinking about some of those problems, but I really hadn't thought in that manner. That's an interesting... I think I would need time to think about that very last part. But the other stuff I can react to. Jim, I think something is dead. A human being or a realm of interest is dead if there are no more windows to open, and if no one is going around opening windows, and there's no interest in opening more windows.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if there was nothing more to explore in orchestra music, I would say that it would soon grind itself in the dust. But something wonderful has been happening in the last few years that is happening right now, and that is authentic reproductions of things we take for granted. For instance, there are groups that are now playing Beethoven symphonies with appropriate instruments and appropriate numbers of instruments, with a great attempt to stick to his metronomic markings, and with a great attempt to phrase in a manner that was consistent with what we can learn from the documents of Beethoven's phrasing, etc. And what we are hearing is something that is like a cool drink.
Yes.
Wonderfully pure water. It's just it, and that's something new that's taking on.
Isn't there a problem with that simply becoming antiquarianism? Leaving your creativity at the doorstep and becoming a slave to historical research and a composer's loose markings?
Well, if one goes to an art gallery and sees a Renoir or Rembrandt or Rodin, is there any creativity involved in that? I think there is.
Yeah, there is.
And I think it's a two-way creativity in that, in some ways, you're investing energy in that artwork.
Yes.
Helps it to maintain its cultural life, and by being surprised by it and it invading you, it helps you be alive.
That's true. That's true. There is a dynamism built into music that isn't built, though, into the visual arts, and that is that you not only have a composer, but you have and a listener or a viewer, but you have another person in there, and that's the musician, who adds a third creative element, and there's a lot of...
more than that. I think in art galleries you have something that is close to that. You have a selector
A curator.
A curator.
Yes.
Who decides what is going to be available for the public to see. All right, in music you have an orchestra, you have a conductor, you have a composer, you also have somebody that decides what's going to be played. You also have a record company that decides out of all the things they play what's going to be recorded. You have,
yes.
What's available depends on a number of rather invisible and, I'm sorry, very powerful people that are invisible.
Yeah,
for instance,
that's true.
I have access to grind. And one of them is there's this wonderful, wonderful compact disc that was just issued of probably for me the greatest cellist of the century, Emanuel Feuermann, with some recordings that have been unavailable since 1927 from Germany. And I have been so delighted in the last week, thanks to a student of mine that had a compact disc player. I don't have one yet, but I got to listen to them, and they're astounding. Listening to that was a pleasure and a pain because Emanuel Feuermann and I believe Simon Goldberg and definitely Paul Hindemith, the composer, had a trio, and they recorded a Beethoven Serenade Opus 8. They recorded a Hindemith string trio, and they recorded a duet for Violincello, which I have a dub of an old, etc. This hasn't been issued. I wish the people that had decided to issue the 1927 recordings would also decide to reissue those early recordings with Hindemith, because I have maybe 4 minutes of Hindemith playing the viola, and not only was he a great composer, he was an excellent violist.
Good.
But those performances, who decides that, Jim?
Yeah, I don't know. But that leads to another thing. I think that a lot of that's decided by the marketplace. I want to lead into a question about educating the public. It seems to me the public in many ways controls the marketplace. It controls, to some degree, what is presented. And there's always this argument among musicians: do you want to educate your populace or do you want to entertain them? A Beethoven Ninth is entertaining. But if you play a 20th century American chamber work, that quite often verges on education. Can you comment on that?
Jim, as usual, when I talk to you, some of the things you say give me pause for thought. And this gives me pause for thought. Because what I've been thinking, particularly this summer, I read a new book, well, new to me, by Colin Turnbull, the man that studied the Mbuti pygmies in the Ituri forest. He wrote 2 books earlier, which I read. One, The Forest People, about the Mbuti pygmies. Another called the Mountain People, by a tribe that's in horrible conditions, I believe, in Uganda. And very recently, he put out a book called The Human Cycle, which is looking back on his life and his education in India, etc. I didn't know he got one of his degrees from India. I didn't know he lived in Tibet. I knew he worked, for the American Museum of Natural History, and he's British and all that stuff. But one of the points he made has really dominated me, particularly the last part of the summer. There is a link between the Mbuti pygmies in the Ituri forest and leaping all the way to Australia in Arnhem Land, the Aboriginals, and leaping all the way to the United States to the Native Americans. There are differences between those 3 cultures and other so-called primitive cultures, but there is a link, and one of the links is their world viewpoint. These primitive peoples are not so primitive in that 40,000 years ago they solved all the problems of how to eat, how to clothe themselves, their shelter. They solved all that. Their life is spent in ceremony and cultural activities because they've solved all those problems. Not us. We spend 8 hours every day earning all this money so we can have shelter, and not them. They spend their life in ceremony. They're not so primitive. But one of the things they have in common, Jim, is that their world viewpoint, they view humans, the purpose of humans is to nurture the planet. The purpose of humans is to nurture the world so that it sustains its health. I think in Western civilization, in European civilization, unconsciously, without thinking of it, we do not have that viewpoint. Our viewpoint is The purpose of humans on the earth is to exploit the earth, to use the earth, and as with many people, to use it up, to burn the rainforests in Brazil for profit, and whoever ends up with the most marbles wins. I think if the bottom line is the motive in art, you have a kind of difficulty that you also have with the world. If your bottom line is profit, or if your bottom line is nurturing, you'll end up in two different directions, and you'll end up with a situation, two different situations. I would much rather see art be controlled by people that want to nourish it than people that want to make a buck. And so I have problems with today's musical industry. I have problems with a lot of parts of our society because the bottom line rules their decisions. And I think they need a new bottom line. I think the new bottom line ought to be nurturing.
Do you think that's spoken like a true elitist?
Probably.
In many ways, classical music has always been identified as an elitist occupation. And getting back to my education question, I remember many recordings I've heard that the first time I hear a particular piece, I'm not taken by it. It takes a time, an education process on my part to get to the point where I enjoy that piece or really comprehend it. Do you think that classical musicians, classical radio stations are doing their job to educate the public? Because the public, frankly, would probably like to stick in a rut and enjoy the great classical pieces, the ones that you can buy in 2 record sets, 40 great themes.
Well, this is going to come out to be another commercial as far as I'm concerned for KOSU, but all I can say is thank goodness for KOSU, because KOSU certainly educates me.
Paula Price will love that.
They certainly, well, the whole crew does. They certainly educate me. They certainly nourish me. I am constantly hearing things that I have not heard before. I'm constantly hearing things that I would never expect to have heard. That things that I have, like things you say, Jim, I have to think about some of the things you say. And some of the things you say to me, I have to chew on for several days. And it very likely, since it's part of my mental diet, will change my, you are what you eat. And mentally you are what you consume too. And you'll probably affect who I am by some of the things you give me to chew on. Well, radio cannot help but educate people, I guess, because it certainly does that to me without my even trying to have it do that. I mean, I consider KOSU and other public radio stations, I consider them as a nutritional source, without which life would not be possible, perhaps.
Okay. Well, with that very positive note, and all, we will thank Evan Tonzig for another delightful conversation, and say that this is an interview conducted for KOSU Radio, Stillwater, Oklahoma.